Imagine being so rich you can buy anything in the world except the one thing you need the most. That was the life of a paralyzed millionaire who had given up hope. Until one night, a poor little girl knocked on his door and asked the strangest question. Will you trade your leftovers for a miracle? He laughed in her face. But what happened next would change his life. Forever would you trade your leftovers for a miracle? It sounds like a strange question, doesn't it? But this story begins with exactly that. A single question that would flip the life of a powerful millionaire upside down and make the entire city gasp in disbelief. Let me take you inside a mansion where luxury and emptiness lived side by side. A place where the smell of roasted meats, buttered bread, and expensive wine filled the air every night. Yet none of it could fill the one hole that mattered most. The hole inside the heart of Harold Kane, the man everyone knew as the richest yet most miserable soul in the city. Harold had it all. His driveway sparkled with polished cars that most people only saw in magazines. His dining table stretched longer than the eye could follow, always decorated with crystal glasses and golden cutlery. His closets were filled with white suits tailored from Italy, and his walls dripped with paintings worth more than an entire neighborhood. From the outside, you would think this man had unlocked the secret to life. But hidden beneath that white suit, Harold carried a truth he could not buy his way out of. He was paralyzed from the waist down. Years ago, a tragic accident had stolen his ability to walk. At first, he fought it with everything his fortune could afford. Doctors, specialists, private therapies, machines that beeped and buzzed with promises. But none of it worked. He could move the world with his money, but not his own legs. And every morning, as sunlight poured through the tall windows of his mansion, Harold would stare down at his motionless body and feel smaller than the poorest beggar on the street. You see, money can buy you comfort, but it cannot buy you freedom. It cannot buy you joy. And it cannot buy you a miracle. Now, on the other side of the city, far away from marble floors and golden chandeliers, lived a little girl named Amara. She was poor, so poor that even scraps of food felt like a feast. She wore clothes patched by her own tiny hands, shoes that were too big for her feet, and eyes that told a story of hunger, loss, and determination. Amara was only a child, but she carried the weight of survival not just for herself, but also for her younger brother. Every day she walked the streets with a small basket of flowers, hoping someone would buy one so she could trade a little beauty for a little bread. But Amara was different from other children in one extraordinary way. She believed in miracles. Not the kind you read in books, not the kind that vanish when the story ends. No, she believed in real miracles, miracles that could happen to anyone, anywhere, even to a poor little girl like her. And so fate, or perhaps something greater, arranged the most unlikely meeting one evening when Amara followed the smell of discarded food. She traced it to the gates of Harold Kane's mansion. Imagine the scene. On one side, a girl with an empty stomach, barefoot, clutching her basket of wilting flowers. On the other side, a mansion glowing with lights, guarded by iron gates, and inside it, a man drowning in riches yet starved of hope. Amara stood at the gate, her stomach growling, her eyes wide not with fear, but with courage. She knew she didn't belong there. Children like her didn't knock on doors like that. But something stronger than fear pushed her forward. She raised her hand and knocked. Once, twice. The butler opened the gate, frowning. He had seen beggars before, and usually they were shooed away. But Amara didn't beg. She stood tall. Well, as tall as her tiny frame could, and said words that shocked the old butler so much that he forgot to slam the door in her face. "I don't want money," she said softly. "I just want leftovers." The butler blinked, confused. No one had ever asked like that before. And so, with hesitation, he let her in. Step by step, Amara entered a world she had never seen before. Chandeliers sparkled above her. Floors shone like mirrors beneath her feet. Servants moved silently like shadows. And there, at the far end of the grand dining hall, sat Harold Kane in his gleaming white suit, his cold eyes fixed on her like a judge waiting for a trial to begin. The room fell silent. You could almost hear the ticking of the gold clock on the wall. Amara, the poor flower seller, faced a paralyzed millionaire. And then came the words that would set the stage for everything to follow. Amara looked him straight in the eye, her voice steady, her spirit unshaken. "Sir," she said, "I will trade you something. You give me your leftovers, and I will give you a miracle." Think about that for a moment. A child with nothing offering a miracle to a man who had everything. The servants froze. The butler's jaw dropped. And Harold Kane, he burst into laughter, the kind of laughter that wasn't joy but disbelief. "A miracle?" he scoffed. "From you? What could you possibly give me that all my millions have failed to buy?" But Amara didn't laugh. She didn't even flinch. Her eyes burned with quiet strength. And with that single moment, the story of a girl with faith and a man with wealth collided like fire and steel. This was the beginning. A question at a dinner table, a laugh that hid pain, and a promise that something impossible was about to unfold. Because sometimes miracles don't come dressed in gold. Sometimes they knock softly on your door, hungry, barefoot, and braver than anyone you've ever met. And Harold Kane was about to learn that his life, his body, and his heart would never be the same again. The world knew Harold Kane as the man who had everything. His name was printed in glossy magazines, whispered about in boardrooms, and envied by competitors who could only dream of reaching his level. To the public, he was a legend of success, a man who rose from nothing, built empires, and became a symbol of power. But behind closed doors, Harold's story was far from the fairy tale people imagined. Let's paint the picture. Harold's mansion wasn't just big. It was colossal. A long driveway lined with fountains and trimmed hedges led to iron gates taller than most houses. Every evening, the gates opened to luxury cars, limousines, and guests wearing designer suits and gowns. His dining hall could seat over 50 people, though most nights Harold dined alone. His kitchen staff prepared meals fit for kings. Lamb roasted in herbs, fresh lobsters flown in from across oceans, desserts drizzled with gold flakes. But no matter how grand the food, Harold could never taste joy in it. You see, wealth had wrapped Harold in comfort, but it had also chained him in silence. Because all the riches in the world could not change one cruel truth. Harold had been paralyzed for 7 long years. It began with a car crash. One rainy night, his driver swerved too late, and Harold's car slammed into a steel barrier. He survived, but the accident shattered his spine. When he woke in a hospital, the doctors gave him news that cut deeper than any wound. He would never walk again. For a man who built his empire with sheer determination, those words felt like a death sentence. At first, Harold fought back. He refused to accept it. He flew to Switzerland, Germany, Japan, anywhere doctors promised a breakthrough. He paid millions for treatments, machine surgeries, even untested therapies. His mansion filled with exercise equipment, therapists, and nurses. Every morning, they lifted his legs, stretched his muscles, and tried to spark life into them. For a while, he convinced himself progress was coming. He swore he felt tingles, swore he saw a flicker of movement. But every time, the hope ended in disappointment. Eventually, Harold stopped trying. He fired half the staff, threw away the therapy machines, and locked himself in routine. Eat, read, sign papers, stare at the world from his window. Repeat. His wealth bought him respect. But respect felt hollow when he couldn't even stand on his own 2 feet. The cruelest part wasn't the physical pain. It was the humiliation. Harold hated being seen as weak. He hated the way guests lowered their eyes when he entered a room, as if his chair defined him. He hated the way whispers followed him at charity galas. So sad. All that money and he stuck like that. What Harold hated most of all was pity. He didn't want compassion. He wanted freedom. But freedom never came. So he built walls around himself. His laughter grew rare. His smile disappeared, and his heart hardened. He treated his servants like robots, his business partners like pawns, and anyone who dared to offer him sympathy like an enemy. To the world, he was still the great Harold Kane. To himself, he was a prisoner in a body that betrayed him. And yet, there was a strange contradiction about Harold. Though he despised weakness, he secretly envied those who had hope. When his nurses spoke about their families, when his gardener hummed hymns while trimming roses, when he overheard laughter in the servants' quarters, something inside him twisted. He couldn't understand it. How could people with so little be so free? But Harold buried that thought quickly. He told himself hope was for the poor, for the dreamers, for the desperate. He was above that. He was a realist. And realists didn't wait for miracles. They accepted facts. The fact was, his legs were dead and no miracle was coming. Or so he thought. It was a cold evening when fate decided to introduce Harold to someone who would shatter that belief. He sat at the head of his massive dining table, as usual, while servants cleared away plates of untouched food. Lobster tails, roasted vegetables, freshly baked bread, all sliding into silver trays to be tossed. Harold barely noticed. Eating was routine, nothing more. But outside his gates, a pair of small eyes noticed everything. Those eyes belonged to Amara, a hungry little girl who'd been following the scent of those leftovers for blocks. To her, the discarded food wasn't waste, it was survival. To Harold, it was nothing. But in the strangest twist of destiny, that difference, the careless waste of one man and the desperate need of one child, was about to collide. And this collision would reveal something Harold never believed in. That even a man drowning in wealth could be rescued, not by doctors or machines, but by the faith of a little girl who had nothing to give but hope. Because Harold Kane, the man who once laughed at miracles, was about to come face to face with one. While Harold Kane sat in his marble palace, surrounded by chandeliers and servants, far across town lived a girl whose world was the exact opposite. Her name was Amara. She was just 11 years old, but her life carried the weight of someone far older. Amara's home wasn't a mansion. It was a crumbling one-room shelter at the edge of the city. The walls leaked when it rained, and the floor was more dirt than cement. The only furniture was a wooden crate that served as a table, 2 thin mattresses, and a rusted stove that hardly worked. Yet inside that small space, Amara kept alive a spirit that refused a break. Her parents had passed away when she was very young, leaving her and her little brother, Samuel, to face the world alone. Samuel was only 7, a boy with big brown eyes that sparkled with innocence despite the hunger that gnawed at his belly. Amara had taken on the role of both sister and mother. She cooked when there was food, comforted him when the nights grew too cold, and told him stories about brighter days, even when she wasn't sure if those days would ever come. Every morning, Amara woke before sunrise. She had a small basket and a bundle of wildflowers she picked from roadside patches or from the cracks of abandoned lots. She tied them carefully with scraps of ribbon she collected from the trash. Then she walked into the busy streets, offering flowers to strangers. "Would you like one, sir?" "Only a coin," she'd ask politely. Some ignored her, some frowned, some laughed, and every now and then a kind soul would drop a coin in her basket. That single coin would mean bread for her and Samuel, maybe even a handful of rice. But the hardest days were when no one bought anything. Amara would return home with an empty basket and a heavy heart, trying to smile so Samuel wouldn't see her pain. "Tomorrow will be better," she'd whisper to him as they fell asleep, stomachs growling in the dark. Yet despite everything, hunger, cold, rejection, Amara carried something most people in the city had lost: faith. She believed the world could change, that miracles were possible. Whenever Samuel cried, she would lift his chin and say, "Don't give up. Even the smallest light can break the darkest night." This faith didn't come from wealth or comfort. It came from survival. Amara had seen days when kindness appeared out of nowhere, a stranger sharing bread, a passerby slipping her a warm scarf, or a neighbor letting her and Samuel rest by a fire during the winter. To Amara, these weren't coincidences. They were miracles, reminders that no matter how cruel the world seemed, hope always found a way to sneak in. Still, life was harsh. There were nights Samuel begged for food, tears streaming down his face, and Amara could only hold him and promise tomorrow would be different. She often went to bed with guilt eating at her more than the hunger. She was just a child herself, but she had to be strong for him. One evening, after a particularly hard day with no sales, Amara wandered through the richer side of town. Her basket was empty, her legs tired, her brother waiting at home with nothing to eat. As she walked, a sweet, heavy smell drifted through the air: roasted chicken, butter, and freshly baked bread. She followed it instinctively, her nose leading her feet. The scent brought her to a towering mansion she had only heard whispers about, the home of Harold Kane. The iron gates gleamed under the lamps, and inside, servants carried trays stacked high with food. But what shocked Amara wasn't the abundance. It was what they did with it. She watched as the servants scraped entire plates into silver bins. Lobster shells with meat still clinging to them, untouched loaves of bread, desserts decorated with fruits she had never even tasted. All thrown away. Her stomach tightened, but her heart pounded with something more than hunger. Something rose in her chest, an urge, a voice whispering, knock. Ask. Don't walk away this time. But how could she? She was just a poor girl with a basket of wilted flowers, barefoot and ragged. What would a man like Harold Kane think if she dared to knock on his gates? Still, she thought of Samuel, waiting at home. She thought of the way he curled up when hunger hurt too much. And she thought of her own belief that miracles came when you had the courage to ask. So Amara wiped her face, stood straighter than she ever had before, and stepped toward the gate. Her hands trembled, but she clenched her fists and knocked. Once, twice, the sound echoed like thunder in her ears. The butler appeared, tall and stern. He looked down at her with suspicion, ready to send her away. But Amara lifted her chin, looked him in the eye, and spoke with a voice stronger than her tiny body suggested. I don't want money, she said. I just want leftovers. For a moment, the butler froze. He had seen beggars before, heard pleas for coins or scraps. But this girl's tone was different. She wasn't whining. She wasn't desperate. She was dignified, as though she wasn't begging at all, but offering something in return. And in truth, Amara was offering something in return. She didn't know it yet, but her courage to ask that night would change not only her life and Samuel's, but also the life of the man inside, the one who had everything yet felt emptier than anyone she had ever met. The butler hesitated. Then, with a curious frown, he opened the gate and motioned her inside. And just like that, two worlds, one of poverty and faith, the other of wealth and despair, were about to collide in the most unexpected way. The heavy iron gates creaked open, and Amara stepped across the threshold into a world she had only glimpsed from far away. For a moment, she froze. Everything about Harold Kane's mansion seemed otherworldly. The manicured gardens with fountains shaped like angels, the marble steps that gleamed under golden lamps, the tall windows that reflected the city lights like mirrors. Her bare feet pressed against the cold stone walkway as the butler led her forward. She clutched her empty flower basket tightly, her heart hammering in her chest. She had expected rejection, maybe even anger, but instead she was being guided deeper into the very heart of wealth itself. The enormous doors opened with a low groan, revealing a grand hallway that seemed endless. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks, spilling light onto marble floors polished so smooth she could see her reflection. The air smelled of roses, polished wood, and roasted meats still lingering from dinner. Amara had never seen such luxury. Her entire world could have fit inside this hallway alone. And yet, as she looked around, she didn't feel envy. She felt something else, a strange awareness. For all its beauty, the house felt cold, too quiet, too empty. The butler walked her into the dining hall, and that was when Amara saw him. At the far end of the room, seated at a long dining table draped in velvet, sat Harold Kane. He was dressed in his signature white suit, crisp and spotless. A glass of wine sat untouched beside him, and behind him loomed tall windows where the moonlight spilled in like silver paint. His wheelchair was almost hidden by the table, but Amara's sharp eyes noticed immediately. Harold's gaze fixed on her, sharp and unyielding. It wasn't a look of a curious host. It was a look of a man who had spent years protecting himself from pity and lies. His gray eyes were cold steel, studying her as though she were a puzzle he had no patience for. Amara's throat went dry. She knew this was the moment everything hinged on. One wrong word, one sign of weakness, and she would be thrown out. But she remembered Samuel waiting at home. She remembered her promise to herself, that miracles required courage. So she stepped forward, barefoot, ragged, and yet strangely dignified. She bowed her head briefly in respect, then raised her chin and spoke with clarity. "Sir," she said, her voice small but unwavering, "I don't want money. I only ask for your leftovers." The dining hall went silent. The servants who were clearing the table paused, their hands frozen midair. The butler raised an eyebrow, as if bracing himself for Harold's temper. For a moment, Harold said nothing. His gaze traveled over her, her torn dress, her scuffed feet, her thin frame. Most people in his position might have pitied her, but Harold didn't. Pity was something he hated, and he refused to give it even to a child. Leftovers, Harold finally said, his voice deep, tinged with disbelief. You walked into my home to ask me for scraps? Amara didn't flinch. She met his eyes and replied, Not scraps, sir. Food. Enough to feed me and my brother. Her honesty struck Harold like a quiet blow. Most beggars he'd seen on the street spun elaborate stories or exaggerated their suffering. But this girl? She simply asked, plainly, almost respectfully. Still, Harold's pride wasn't about to let her see any softness. He leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a mocking smile. Tell me, child, he said, why should I give you even a crumb? What will you give me in return? The servants exchanged nervous glances. This was a test Harold gave everyone. Make them prove their worth. Show them they had something to offer. But Amara didn't look nervous. She tightened her grip on her basket and took a deep breath. I will trade you something, she said firmly. You give me your leftovers, and I will give you a miracle. The words echoed through the hall. A miracle, from the mouth of a barefoot girl standing in front of a man who had spent millions chasing one. For the first time in years, Harold laughed, a low, bitter laugh that filled the room. A miracle, he said, shaking his head. Do you know who I am? Do you know how much I've spent chasing miracles? Doctors, machines, treatments. Nothing worked. And you, he pointed a finger at her, you think you could offer me what the world's best minds could not? Amara stood her ground. Yes, she said simply. Harold's laughter died. He studied her again, searching for signs of deceit, for the usual tricks beggars played. But all he saw were eyes burning with quiet certainty. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Tell me then, he challenged, what miracle do you think you can give me? Amara's voice softened, but her words carried weight. Faith, hope, the belief you have forgotten. That is the miracle I offer. The room went utterly still. The servants lowered their eyes, almost as if they too felt the gravity of her words. Harold's mocking smile faded for the briefest second, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years. Something dangerously close to curiosity. But curiosity was a weakness he couldn't afford. So Harold quickly masked it with coldness. Faith, he scoffed. Hope? You think empty words can heal what's broken. Amara didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply folded her hands and said, Allow me to prove it, sir. Give me one chance. The silence that followed was heavy. Harold's mind raced. He wanted to dismiss her, to send her back into the night. And yet something in her voice, in her unshaken gaze, made it impossible. Against his own better judgment, Harold found himself leaning forward. Fine, he said finally, his voice low. I'll give you one chance. Amuse me, little girl. Show me this miracle you claim to carry. And with those words, the game began. Amara had stepped into the lion's den and, with nothing but faith and courage, had managed to spark something Harold thought was long dead. The tiniest flicker of belief. What she didn't know was that this flicker would soon grow into a fire powerful enough to change both of their lives forever. The hall was quiet, heavy with the weight of Amara's words. She had said it so simply, so fearlessly, that for a moment it didn't sound like a child speaking. It sounded like someone far older, wiser, someone carrying a truth that Harold Kane had long buried. He narrowed his eyes at her. A miracle, he repeated slowly, as though testing the word on his tongue. And you claim you can give me this miracle in exchange for what? Leftovers. Amara nodded. Yes. The servants shifted uncomfortably. To them, this was absurd. A barefoot girl offering something that billion-dollar hospitals couldn't. Yet none of them dared to laugh. Not with Harold watching. Harold leaned back in his wheelchair, folding his hands across his chest. Do you even know who I am, child? Do you know how many doctors I've hired? How many scientists, healers, so-called miracle workers have walked through this very hall, promising me cures, only to leave in failure. Amara's eyes didn't waver. Yes, sir, but none of them had what I have. His lips twisted into a half-smile. And what exactly is that? Faith, she replied, and the courage to believe when no one else does. Her words struck something deep inside Harold, though he fought to push it down. For years, he had built walls around his heart, convincing himself that hope was useless, that faith was nothing but a trick for the weak. Yet here stood a girl, skin and bones, asking for scraps of food, but offering something priceless in return. Belief. Harold scoffed, trying to mask the unease stirring within him. Faith doesn't heal broken bones. Courage doesn't mend spinal cords. I don't need words, girl. I need legs. Amara took a step closer. The servants tensed, but Harold raised a hand to stop them. He was curious now, though he wouldn't admit it. You want legs, Amara said softly, but what you need is hope. You've been alive all these years, sir, but you stopped living. That is why nothing has worked for you. You don't believe anymore. The words hit Harold like a blade. His jaw tightened. For a moment, anger flashed in his eyes. Who was this child to lecture him, to expose the truth he buried under pride? He wanted to shout at her, to throw her out. But the anger faded almost as quickly as it came, replaced by something far more dangerous. Recognition. Deep down, he knew she was right. Harold's voice dropped, almost a whisper. And what do you suggest I do, little preacher? Fall to my knees and pray? He gave a bitter laugh, gesturing to his useless legs. As you can see, I can't even kneel. Amara's expression didn't change. She stepped even closer, until she stood right in front of him, her small frame dwarfed by his towering chair. She set down her flower basket and looked him directly in the eye. Then let me pray for you, she said simply. The hall seemed to gasp. The butler nearly dropped the tray he was holding. One of the maids clutched her apron nervously. Never, in all the years they had served Harold Kane, had anyone spoken to him like that. Not even his doctors. Harold stared at her, stunned into silence. A child offering to pray for him? He felt laughter bubbling up again. But this time it faltered before it escaped. Something about the way she said it, calm, certain, without the slightest hesitation, made the words impossible to dismiss. Finally, he found his voice. You want to pray for me? Yes, Amara said, nodding firmly. One prayer. That's all I ask. In exchange, I only want the food you would throw away. Harold rubbed his temple, trying to understand this strange child. He had heard every kind of pitch from people trying to get his money. Schemes, sob stories, wild promises. But this wasn't a scheme. She wasn't asking for money or riches or even pity. She was asking for what he discarded every night. And in return, she wanted to give him something he hadn't felt in years. For a moment, Harold considered saying no. His pride told him to send her away, to crush this foolishness before it spread. Yet his curiosity whispered otherwise. What harm could it do? Let her say her little prayer, feed her, and be done with it. Fine, Harold said at last, his voice steady but laced with sarcasm. You may have your chance. Amuse me, little girl. Let us see what this miracle looks like. The servants exchanged bewildered glances, unsure whether to laugh or to cry. But Amara didn't smile or celebrate. She simply bowed her head and whispered, Thank you, sir. Then, without hesitation, she placed her small hands on Harold's legs. His body stiffened instantly. No one touched him without permission, not even his doctors. Yet this child touched him with no fear, no hesitation, as though she already knew she had the right. The hall fell into an almost sacred silence. Even the chandeliers seemed to flicker softly, as if the very air was holding its breath. Amara closed her eyes and began to pray. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the vast dining room. She didn't use fancy words or long verses. She spoke from the heart, simple and pure. She prayed for healing, yes, but more than that, she prayed for hope. She prayed that Harold's heart would remember what it meant to believe. She prayed for courage to return to a man who had forgotten it. As her words filled the room, Harold felt something strange. It wasn't physical, at least not at first. It was something deeper, something he couldn't explain. A warmth stirred in his chest, spreading slowly, filling cracks he didn't know were there. He wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, to call it foolishness, but the sensation only grew. For the first time in years, Harold Kane, the man who mocked hope, felt something shift inside him. When Amara finally lifted her hands and opened her eyes, she didn't look at him with expectation. She didn't demand anything. She simply said, "Your miracle has already begun." Then she picked up her basket, waiting quietly for her plate of leftovers. Harold stared at her, torn between disbelief and an unfamiliar, unwelcome flicker of could it be? Hope. And though he would never admit it aloud, Harold Kane, the man who laughed at miracles, suddenly found himself wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, he had just witnessed the beginning of one. For a long moment after Amara finished her prayer, silence ruled the hall. Harold Kane sat in his grand wheelchair, staring at the frail little girl who just dared to place her hands on him as though she held the power to undo fate itself. His lips parted, but no words came out. He felt something strange, a tingling warmth deep inside. But Harold Kane was not a man who allowed feelings to rule him. He was a man of numbers, of logic, of power, and he would not let a child, especially a poor one, trick him into believing in fairy tales. Finally, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "So," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "is this it? Should I stand up now and walk across the room?" Amara's gaze didn't falter. "Not yet," she replied softly. "But the change has already started inside you. The rest will follow." Her calm certainty unsettled him more than if she had begged him to believe. She wasn't trying to prove herself. She wasn't desperate. She simply knew. Harold smirked, trying to cover his unease. "Very well, then, let's put your little miracle to the test." The servants exchanged worried looks. They knew that tone in Harold's voice. Whenever he was challenged, he turned ruthless. "What do you want me to do, sir?" Amara asked, her voice steady. Harold tapped his fingers on the armrest of his wheelchair. "You claim your prayer has already begun some sort of miracle. Prove it. If your words hold power, then surely I should feel something by now." Amara tilted her head thoughtfully. "You do feel something, don't you?" she asked gently. Her question caught him off guard. For a brief second, his eyes widened. Had she seen the faint tremor in his fingers? The strange warmth rising through his chest? He quickly masked it with a scoff. "You're a clever one," he said sharply. "But feelings mean nothing. I want results." He gestured to his legs. "Move them. If your miracle is real, then make them obey me." The servants gasped softly. It was a cruel challenge. Everyone in the house knew Harold had no movement in his legs below the waist. Not since the accident. For years, doctors had confirmed there was no signal, no chance, no possibility. And yet here he was, demanding a child to do what science could not. But Amara didn't flinch. She looked at his legs, then back at him, and shook her head slowly. "That's not how it works, sir. I'm not the one who makes them move. You are." Her words cut deep, like a blade through armor. Harold's jaw clenched. "Me?" He wanted to snap at her, to remind her that he had spent years trying, begging, commanding his body to respond. Yet, the way she said it made his heart skip. "Fine," Harold growled. "Then I'll show you just how foolish your faith is." He placed both hands on the arms of his chair, bracing himself. For years, he had sat in this position, staring down at his useless legs, willing them to obey. Each time ended the same, with nothing but frustration and bitterness. But tonight, under the piercing gaze of a child, something inside him shifted. The hall was silent as Harold tried. His fingers gripped the armrests, his jaw tightened, and sweat beaded his forehead. His legs remained still. Seconds felt like hours. Then something happened. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A twitch, the smallest flicker in his right foot. So small that even the servants missed it. But Harold felt it. For the first time in years, he felt movement. His eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed quickly to hide it. No, it was nothing. Just a spasm, a trick of the nerves. But Amara had seen it. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "You see," she whispered. Harold froze. He wanted to deny it, to claim it was imagination, but the memory of that tiny twitch burned in his mind. His heart raced faster than it had in years. He shook his head violently. "Coincidence," he barked. "Muscle spasms. It means nothing." Amara's voice stayed calm, steady as stone. "It means a miracle has begun. You can deny it, but your body knows the truth." The servants glanced at one another nervously. They had all lived under Harold's iron rule for years, but tonight they were witnessing something entirely new, a battle not of wealth or power, but of pride against possibility. Harold Kane, the man who had conquered empires of business, was shaken by the faith of a little girl with nothing but a basket of flowers and a request for scraps. "Enough," Harold snapped, his voice louder than before. "I've indulged your foolishness long enough. Go now, take your food, and leave." But his command lacked its usual bite. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the turmoil within. Amara didn't argue. She bent down, picked up the plate of leftovers the maid had quietly set aside, and placed it gently into her basket. But before she turned to go, she looked Harold directly in the eyes one last time. "You can laugh, sir. You can deny what happened tonight. But the miracle has already started. Whether you believe or not doesn't change that. I'll be back tomorrow to see how much stronger it has grown." With that, she bowed politely, lifted her basket, and walked toward the great doors of the hall. Harold watched her leave, his mind a storm of contradictions. His pride screamed at him to dismiss her words as nonsense. Yet deep inside, in a place he hadn't visited in years, a spark flickered, a spark he feared, but also desperately longed for. The doors closed behind her. Silence filled the mansion once again. And for the first time in years, Harold Kane didn't laugh at the idea of miracles. He feared them. He doubted them. But he could no longer ignore them. Because tonight, his dead legs had moved. The night after Amara left was unlike any Harold Kane had lived in years. For over a decade, his routine had been predictable. Meals at precise hours, a drink before bed, and long, restless nights staring at the ceiling, battling the quiet torment of his condition. But this night was different. Sleep refused to come easily. He replayed the events of the evening over and over in his mind. That ridiculous little girl with her flower basket, her steady eyes, her unshakable voice. And then, that twitch. Harold clenched his fists, whispering to himself in the dark. It was nothing, just nerves. Nothing more. But another voice, quieter yet insistent, whispered back. Or maybe it was a beginning. By dawn, he was exhausted. Yet when his butler rolled him into the dining hall for breakfast, Harold found himself glancing at the great front doors more often than at his plate. A part of him, one he hated admitting, was waiting. And sure enough, she came. Just as the servants were clearing the silver trays, the tall oak doors creaked open. There she was again, Amara, the same patched dress, the same dusty sandals, the same basket slung at her side. But this time, there was no hesitation in her step. She walked into the hall as though she belonged there. The servant stiffened, uncertain whether to stop her, but Harold raised his hand. His eyes locked onto hers. "You came back," he said, his voice low, half surprised, half accusing. "I told you I would." Amara answered simply. "A promise is a promise." She set her basket down at the edge of the table, then stood quietly waiting. Harold studied her. Everything in him wanted to laugh, to belittle her again, to remind her that miracles belonged in fairy tales. But that twitch, oh, that cursed twitch, haunted him. He couldn't ignore it. Finally, he spoke. "Very well. What do you intend to do today, little prophetess? Another prayer? Another performance?" Amara smiled faintly. "Not a performance. Just faith." She walked closer until she stood right beside his chair again. "May I?" she asked, pointing to his legs. For a moment, Harold hesitated. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he nodded. Amara knelt beside him, her hands once again resting gently on his lifeless legs. Her touch was light, almost feather-like, yet it carried an odd weight, a sense of certainty that unsettled him. She closed her eyes. This time, she didn't speak aloud immediately. She stayed silent for several long moments, as though listening to something Harold couldn't hear. Then her soft voice rose, steady and sure. She prayed again, not for riches, not for pity, but for healing, hope, and the breaking of chains Harold had worn for too long. The words flowed like water, simple yet powerful, washing over the room with a calmness even the servants felt. As she prayed, Harold fought within himself. His mind screamed at him to resist, to reject the foolishness. But his heart leaned in, hungry for something that had been starved for too long. And then it happened. The twitch again, but stronger this time. His right foot jerked just slightly, but undeniably. His breath caught. His hands gripped the armrest of his chair, as though he'd seen a ghost. "Did you see that?" he barked suddenly, turning toward the nearest servant. The butler's eyes widened. He had seen it too. "Yes, sir," the butler stammered. "Your foot, it moved." A wave of whispers rippled through the staff. The maids exchanged astonished looks. One covered her mouth in shock. Harold's heart pounded in his chest. He turned back to Amara, his voice shaking. What are you doing to me?" Amara opened her eyes, her expression calm, almost serene. "I'm not doing anything, sir." "You are. Your body is remembering what hope feels like, and hope brings strength." Her words cut through him like a blade. For years, Harold had lived without it. Without hope, without belief, without the will to fight. And now, with just 2 prayers from a child, his body had responded in ways doctors swore were impossible. Yet his pride clung desperately to denial. It's coincidence," he muttered, though even he didn't sound convinced. Amara stood, dusting off her dress. "You can call it what you like, but the miracle has begun. Tomorrow it will be stronger still." She picked up her basket and held it out. "Now, may I have today's leftovers?" The absurdity of her request almost made Harold laugh. A child who had just shaken the very foundation of his reality wasn't asking for money or reward. She was still asking for scraps. Without a word, Harold gestured to the cook. A plate piled with uneaten breakfast was quickly placed into her basket. Amara thanked him politely, then turned to Harold once more. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said with quiet certainty, and walked out of the hall. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. The servants didn't know what to say. Some looked at Harold with awe, others with fear. Harold himself sat frozen, his mind a storm. His heart thundered in his chest as his foot twitched again, unprompted this time. A shiver ran down his spine. For the first time in years, Harold Kane, paralyzed millionaire, skeptic of miracles, felt something stirring that terrified him more than his paralysis ever had. Hope. And though he hated to admit it, he found himself waiting eagerly for the next day. The next day dawned differently for Harold Kane. For years, mornings had been the worst. He would awaken to the cruel reminder of his condition, motionless legs, the sting of helplessness, and the hollow ache of another day in the same prison. But this morning was not the same. As the golden rays of sunlight streamed through the mansion windows, Harold sat in his wheelchair, staring at his feet. He had dismissed it as coincidence, nerves, imagination, but there was again a flicker, a twitch, and this time he saw it with his own eyes. The reality hit him hard. Something was happening, something he couldn't explain, something no doctor had ever given him reason to believe. And though he tried to bury it beneath layers of pride, the truth whispered louder. The girl was right. By noon, Harold was restless. He barked at his staff, demanded to be rolled into the hall, and then, against his usual pattern, asked them to open the front doors. He didn't say why, but deep inside he knew he was waiting for her. And just as the clock struck the hour, there she was, Amara. Her patched dress swayed as she walked, her basket in hand, her face lit with the same quiet confidence that unsettled him. She stepped into the hall as though it was hers, as though she had been born to walk into places no one else dared. "You came again," Harold muttered, his voice low, trying to mask his anticipation. "I told you I would," Amara said softly. "The miracle is growing." Harold swallowed hard. His pride urged him to sneer, to dismiss her words. But instead, he heard himself whisper, "Do it again." Amara tilted her head. "Do what?" "Pray," Harold said quickly, almost too quickly. Like yesterday. A faint smile touched her lips. She didn't mock him. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded, set her basket aside, and knelt once more by his chair. Her small hands rested on his legs. Again her eyes closed, her voice rising steady and pure. She prayed with the same calm faith, words like sunlight warming the cold walls of his heart. And then it happened. Not just a twitch, not just a spasm. His toes curled. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably, they obeyed him. Harold's breath caught. His heart thundered so violently he thought it might burst. He leaned forward, staring at his feet in disbelief. Again, he whispered, almost begging himself. He focused, willed it, and there his foot shifted. Both servants nearest him gasped aloud. Tears stung Harold's eyes. For years, his body had been a graveyard of broken dreams. But now, for the first time in over a decade, he was alive from the waist down. Amara opened her eyes, her voice calm but filled with quiet joy. The chains are breaking. Harold's face twisted. He wanted to deny it, to cling to skepticism, but he couldn't. His body was proving her right. For a long moment, silence ruled the hall, broken only by Harold's ragged breathing. Then, in a trembling voice he hadn't used since childhood, he asked, How is this possible? Amara looked at him with eyes far older than her years. Because you believed, if only for a moment. You let hope, Indiana. That's all a miracle needs. Her words shattered him. Harold Kane, who had mocked hope, who had crushed faith beneath his wealth, was now living proof of its power. He looked at her with something he hadn't felt in years, gratitude. Why me? He whispered. Amara smiled gently. Because even the richest man in the world can be the poorest if he has no hope. And sometimes the poorest child must remind him what true riches are. Her words cut deep, leaving Harold speechless. The servants, who had always seen Harold as a tyrant, now looked at him with new eyes. They had watched the impossible unfold. Their master, once a prisoner in his own body, had taken his first steps toward freedom. Not through wealth, not through power, but through the faith of a little girl. But Amara didn't stay for applause. She didn't boast or linger. She picked up her basket, now filled with scraps of food, and bowed her head. Tomorrow, she said simply, we'll see even more. And with that, she left. Harold sat in silence long after she was gone. His heart was a storm. Pride, fear, awe, hope, all colliding inside him. For years, he had scoffed at the very idea of miracles. But now, with his own feet moving before his eyes, he could no longer deny it. The transformation had begun, not only in his body but in his soul. That night, Harold Kane did something he hadn't done in decades. He prayed. It was awkward, stumbling, unsure. He didn't even know who he was speaking to. But with trembling words, he whispered into the darkness, If you're real, thank you. For the first time in his life, Harold Kane, the paralyzed millionaire, the man who once laughed at miracles, felt the stirring of something greater than wealth, greater than power, faith, and it terrified him. And yet, deep inside, it thrilled him more than anything money had ever bought. The miracle was no longer just beginning. It was unfolding. For days, the impossible continued. Each morning, Amara returned. Each evening, Harold Kane found himself stronger. First his toes curled, then his ankles shifted. Soon, he could lift his legs an inch, then two. Every tiny victory shook him to the core, for each one mocked the doctor's verdict that he would never walk again. The staff watched in awe, whispering among themselves that a miracle was happening before their very eyes. Some crossed themselves. Some cried quietly in corners, but none dared speak of it outside the mansion walls. Yet with each step of progress, Harold's inner war grew fiercer. Pride screamed at him to take credit, that his body was simply recovering, that science had been wrong. But deep inside, a new voice whispered that this wasn't about science at all. This was something greater, something he could neither buy nor command. And then came the test. It happened one stormy afternoon. The rain pounded against the mansion windows as Harold sat in the great hall, waiting for Amara. The servants lit candles, their flames flickering against the shadows. Harold was anxious, restless. His heart pounded with both hope and fear. The doors opened with creak, but this time Amara wasn't alone. Behind her stumbled a woman, thin, pale, coughing violently into a cloth spotted with blood. Her clothes were torn, her steps weak. Amara held her up, guiding her gently into the hall. Harold frowned. "Who is this?" Amara's voice was soft but urgent. "Her name is Miriam. She's my mother." Gasps rippled through the servants. Harold stiffened. He had never considered that the girl who came day after day for scraps had a family, a life outside these walls. "She's sick," Amara continued, helping her mother into a chair. "The doctor in our village said there's no hope. He said it's too late." Harold's jaw tightened. Those words struck him like a hammer. He had heard them himself years ago when his doctors declared his paralysis permanent. Amara turned to him, her eyes pleading. "Sir, you've seen what faith can do. You've felt it. Please, pray with me for her." The hall fell silent. The servants froze. All eyes turned to Harold. The request hit him like a bolt of lightning. Pray? Him? Harold Kane, the man who had mocked miracles, who had scoffed at hope. He swallowed hard, his pride clawing desperately for control. "Child," he said slowly, "I've allowed you to play your little game here. But this is different." Amara shook her head fiercely. "No, it's not different. It's the same. You receive your miracle. Now it's time to share it." Her words cut deeper than any blade. Share it. Could he? Would he? Harold's chest heaved as his eyes darted to Miriam. Her breathing was shallow, her body frail. She looked at him with eyes heavy from suffering, eyes that had already accepted death. He felt the storm inside him roar. His pride hissed, "What if nothing happens? What if you look foolish? You are Harold Kane. You don't beg, you don't pray." But then came another voice, quieter, steadier. "Didn't you already beg once? Didn't you whisper into the night, 'If you're real, thank you'? Didn't you already feel the answer in your own legs?" His hands trembled. His throat tightened. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. Amara stepped closer, her small hand reaching for his. "Please, sir, this isn't about pride. This is about love." The hall was still. Even the storm outside seemed to pause. Finally, slowly, painfully, Harold Kane lowered his head. His lips moved, uncertain, awkward but sincere. "God, if you're listening, please help her, like you're helping me." The words were raw, unpolished, nothing like the grand speeches Harold used to give at banquets. But they were real. For the first time in his life, Harold Kane wasn't speaking as a millionaire or a master or a man of power. He was speaking as a broken soul asking for mercy. The silence stretched. Nothing happened. Miriam coughed again, weaker this time. Harold's heart sank. His pride whispered, "See? Foolishness. Empty words." But then Amara knelt beside her mother, placed her tiny hands on her, and prayed aloud. And slowly, so slowly Miriam's breathing steadied. The coughing ceased. Her chest rose and fell more evenly. The pain in her eyes faded, replaced by a flicker of strength. The servants gasped. One dropped a tray. Another covered her mouth with trembling hands. Harold's eyes widened. His pulse raced. He had prayed. And though it wasn't perfect, though it wasn't polished, his words had joined with Amara's. And something had happened. Miriam opened her eyes, her lips parting. She whispered hoarsely, "Thank you." Harold Kane felt something break inside him. Walls of pride, built over decades, crumbled in an instant. Tears filled his eyes, hot and unstoppable, spilling down his face in front of everyone. He had wealth, power, influence. Yet none of it compared to this, to the sight of a dying woman breathing freely again, to the touch of hope restored. For the first time in his life, Harold Kane understood what true riches were. The test had come, and by lowering his pride, by choosing faith over doubt, he had passed. The storm outside had passed. The mansion that once echoed with cold silence now buzzed with whispers of awe and gratitude. Servants who once tiptoed around Harold Kane in fear now looked at him with something different. Respect, even love. For in that moment, the proud, untouchable millionaire had been humbled, and in his humility, he had found power greater than all his riches. Harold sat quietly in his chair, staring at his trembling hands. They weren't trembling from weakness anymore, but from the overwhelming flood of emotion rushing through him. For decades, his hands had signed contracts, gripped glasses of expensive champagne, and pointed orders at those beneath him. But now, for the first time, those same hands had been lifted in prayer. And that simple act had changed everything. Miriam sat on a nearby couch, her breathing steadier, her face calmer. Though still frail, there was undeniable life in her eyes now. She clutched her daughter's hand tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered prayers of thanks in her own language. Little Amara, beamed with quiet joy, not the joy of pride or victory, but the deep, unshakable joy of someone who had seen faith rewarded. She looked at Harold and spoke softly. "You see, sir, a miracle is never wasted. When you believe, it grows." Her words pierced him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and for a long moment he couldn't speak. Finally, with a voice heavy with emotion, Harold whispered, "Child, you've given me back more than legs. You've given me back my soul." The servants gasped softly. None of them had ever heard Harold Kane speak this way. For so long, Harold had lived as a man paralyzed not just in body but in heart. Wealth had isolated him. Pride had chained him. Bitterness had poisoned him. But Amara, with nothing but her faith and her courage, had broken through all of it. Harold turned to the girl and her mother. "From this day forward," he said firmly, "you will never want for food, shelter, or care again. You are part of this household now. My family." Amara's eyes widened, and for the first time Harold saw tears fill them. She bowed her head, overwhelmed. Miriam tried to rise in gratitude, but Harold gently raised his hand. "No thanks needed. It is I who owes you everything." The room was silent again, but this time it was a silence filled with awe, reverence, and hope. Days turned to weeks, and the changes in Harold Kane could not be hidden. The man who once barked orders now spoke with gentleness. The master who once dined alone now welcomed the servants, Amara and Miriam, to his table. The wheelchair, once a symbol of his prison, became a reminder of how far he had come. Because though he was walking again, Harold chose to keep in his hall, a testimony of what had once seemed impossible. And as news spread beyond the mansion walls, something remarkable happened. People from the nearby towns, poor, broken, and hopeless, began to come, not for Harold's money, but for his story. They wanted to see the millionaire who had been healed, to hear from a man who once laughed at miracles but now lived by faith. And Harold told them, again and again, with tears in his eyes. He told the story of a little girl who had come for leftovers but brought him life instead. One quiet evening, Harold sat with Amara by the fireplace. The flames danced gently, casting warm light on the walls. He leaned on his cane, not out of necessity, but as a symbol of his journey. "Amara," he said softly, "I spent my life thinking money was the only miracle I needed. I thought power could buy me anything. But you showed me I was wrong." Amara tilted her head curiously. "What do you mean, sir?" Harold smiled faintly. "The greatest miracle isn't walking again. It isn't wealth or health or power. The greatest miracle is love. The love of a child brave enough to believe. The love of a mother who prays through pain. And the love of a God who never gave up on a stubborn, prideful man like me." Amara's smile was small but radiant. She whispered, "And that's why miracles grow, because love never runs out." Harold nodded, his eyes misty. For the first time in years, his heart felt light, free. Redeemed in that, my friends, is the story of the paralyzed millionaire who thought he had everything, until a poor little girl showed him the one thing he lacked: faith. It wasn't his riches that saved him. It wasn't his pride. It was a child's courage and the simple power of love. So, what do you think? Do you believe miracles still happen? Would you have laughed at Amara, or would you have believed her from the start? Tell me in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story touched your heart, make sure to hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs encouragement. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories just like this one. Because sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest miracles.